Here's the challenge with our brains. We're not going to let go of a negative thought that has served us so well, that has kept us safe for so long, right? Even though it's produced stuff that we don't want, it's created challenges for us like imposter syndrome, self-sabotaging, all of those things. But the brain still sees it as something that's keeping us safe. It's not going to let go of that because the brain's priority for you is safety. Now, in order for your brain to let go of that, you have to have something to replace it with, that your brain can begin to see that that positive thought, that optimistic thought, can keep us safe as well. And yes, the benefits of overall well-being are there as well, but your brain isn't always concerned about overall well-being, right? It's concerned about safety. But if you can replace that thought with something that's optimistic, life-giving, increases your well-being, and also feels safe to you, okay? That's going to be important, and that'll allow that other thought to be let go of, and you'll be able to learn how to be more optimistic in your thinking. Hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of the Permission to Love podcast. I'm your host, Jerry Henderson, and I am so grateful that you've taken time out of your busy day to be here and to listen to this episode. Today, we're going to be talking about learned optimism, or training ourselves to be optimistic. You know, so many of us struggle with negative thoughts, those intrusive thoughts. And I've done episodes in the past about our thinking patterns, but today I want to dive specifically into how we can learn to be more optimistic. Negative thinking is almost an epidemic in our world. I mean, we see it on the news. When we talk to people, there seems to be more of a growing trend towards negative thinking or negative speech. So today I really want to help us learn how to be more optimistic, because all the research shows that being optimistic not only helps our mindset, but it helps us physically. It helps our relationships. It helps us holistically. And the good news is we can learn to be optimistic. Now, in a previous episode, I talked about how you're born with a certain set point of happiness. So we do see that certain people are more prone to being negative or thinking negatively, and people who are more prone to thinking optimistically. However, the research is also very clear that the habits that we'll integrate into our life on a daily basis can help us overcome or help us mitigate the set point that we're born with. So if you find that you have a tendency to be more of a negative thinker, the good news is you can train yourself to be a positive or optimistic thinker. And being optimistic isn't just about positive thinking. It's not just about having a good mindset. It has implications for every area of our life. Our emotions, our physical health. People who are optimistic have a tendency to live longer, and they also will have better relationships in their life. They're also more likely to do better at work. So it affects every area of your life, and I hope in today's episode I can give you some tools that can help you become a more optimistic thinker and see the ripple effects of this in your entire life. Now, before I go on, I do want to take a moment and talk about the impact of trauma on our ability to think positively. I have a previous episode on this topic, and you can go back and listen to that. And it is very real that when we've experienced trauma or other painful life experiences, and it can cause us to have more of a negative thinking pattern because we're trying to stay safe. We're trying to predict the future. And so there's all of these things that got wired in our nervous system as a result of trauma. But the good news is trauma doesn't have to continue to control the way that you think. You can make some very positive changes. You can become a very optimistic person, even though you've had some really challenging experiences in your past. And a part of the healing process is shifting the way that we think. You can actually shift into post-traumatic growth. You know, we've heard a lot about PTSD. We've also heard a lot about CPSD, or complex post-traumatic stress disorder. But not a lot of us have heard about PTG, or post-traumatic growth. And learning to be optimistic is a part of that growth process. And you don't have to stay stuck in certain thinking patterns, regardless of what your experience has been. All right, so let's start talking about some of those negative thinking patterns that get us stuck and keep us stuck. And in today's episode, we're going to be specifically talking about some of the cognitive distortions that many people face. So what is a cognitive distortion? It is drawing automatic and erroneous or negative conclusions from the experiences that you've had. Now, there's a couple of key words in there. Automatic. The automatic response that happens to us when we experience something, our systems have been trained to think a certain way, so we kick up a certain thought that then leads to an emotion. That emotion leads to a response or a behavior, and that keeps us cycled in certain patterns that reinforce our belief systems. Now, the second word in there that's really important is the erroneous, or these false conclusions or negative conclusions that we come to. And we're going to talk a little bit about trusting our thinking here in just a second, but I want you to understand a couple of things before we move on. That cognitive distortions, or these errors in thinking, are often automatic and they can be false. So just because you're thinking something doesn't mean that it's automatically true. So take a moment and reflect and ask yourself, have you ever had that happen to you? We've had an experience and all of a sudden, almost automatically, you draw a false or negative thought or conclusion about what happened. For example, if somebody didn't return your text or return your call, instead of thinking that they might be busy or they might just be in a meeting and they can't get back to you right now, you might have started drawing the negative or false conclusion that it means that they don't like you, you did something to offend them, and you spend the next 2 hours worried about what's going on with the relationship, only to find out later that they were tied up doing something and they couldn't get back to you. That's an example of a cognitive distortion, the story that we tell ourselves as a result of an experience that we've had. So let's just go through a few of these, and I would encourage you, as you listen to these, see if you can identify yourself in them. The first is around magnification and minimization. And what this is when we tend to magnify our failures or our faults, and we minimize our successes and the things that are good about us. That's an error in thinking. Another one is dichotomous or all or nothing thinking. You get into that pattern of thinking, I'll never be able to be enough, or this always happens to me, or there's no way this situation can turn out good. It's an error in thinking. Another error in thinking is excessive responsibility or overly personalizing something. You're taking the blame for something that's not even in your control at sometimes, or you're making it as a part of your identity, that you think because you did something bad, that means that you're bad, or that if somebody did something wrong, it means that you're wrong. And so it's that over-personalization in our thinking about events that happen in our lives. Another is overgeneralization, or generalizing everything. So if you had a bad experience in a job interview, or you felt awkward in that job interview, you then generalize and say, well, I'm always awkward. Everybody thinks I'm awkward. I'll be awkward for the rest of my life. And so that's that overgeneralization, which is an error in thinking. Another is should statements. I should be doing this, or this is how I should be acting. Who says that you should be that way? It's an error in thinking to assume that everything should fit into a certain pattern or a certain way of doing something. So if you're thinking that you should always be perfect or you should never mess up, that is a cognitive distortion. It's an error in thinking. And the last one I'll talk about today is catastrophizing, right? It's that cascading of our thinking that happens, that negative outcome. We're projecting like the worst case scenario as a result of an experience. So if you messed up at work, you didn't feel like you did the best in your presentation, then all of a sudden that's cascading into you thinking that your boss thinks you're incompetent. Then every time that your boss, looks at you, you think that they're judging you. And then the boss sets up a meeting with you and you begin to assume that that meeting is about how bad you did, how incompetent you are, and it's going to either be a reprimand or you're going to lose your job. And that's that catastrophizing thinking, right? And then all of a sudden you've lost your job. You're never going to be able to get another job. You're totally incompetent. I mean, it can go pretty deep and pretty dark really fast. That's what catastrophizing thinking does. And it's an error in thinking, and I'm sure that you've seen that in your life, right? Where you thought something was going to turn out so horribly, only to find out that everything worked out okay after all. And so those are just some of the examples of cognitive distortion, and I bet you're able to see yourself in a few of those. I know I certainly have been able to see myself in those, and I still struggle with many of those types of thinking. And it is a journey to heal. And I just want to take a moment to note and to point out that if you're seeing yourself in those categories, you can be guaranteed that other people are struggling with those same type of things, right? One of the challenges or one of the errors in thinking that many of us have is that we think we're the only ones who deal with it. We're the only ones who struggle with that type of thinking. And that can produce a lot of shame in our lives. And it can keep us stuck because we think it's something about us, that we're fundamentally flawed. The reality is everybody experiences cognitive distortion. Everybody struggles with it. Now, some people are better at managing it than other people, okay? But it is something that you can learn. You can learn the skills on how to manage that cognitive distortion or those negative automatic thoughts, and you can learn to replace them with more optimistic thoughts. And we're going to talk about that here in just a second. But before I move on, I just want to make sure that you hear me on this. You're not the only one who struggles with it. And you can't always trust your thinking, okay? Just because you're thinking a thought doesn't mean it's true. You are not your thoughts. Your mind gets conditioned into certain thinking patterns, and it's to keep you safe. It's to predict the future. Your mind is a meaning-making machine. It is also a problem-solving machine, and it doesn't always spit out the best equations, okay? And so that's why we have to learn some of these skill sets to really examine how we're thinking. But trust me in saying that you can't always trust what you're thinking. How do I know? Because I've lived through it myself, and I've coached other people through it. And one of the biggest things about coaching is to help people think differently. It's to help them reframe the narratives that are going on in their mind and to help mirror back how they're thinking so that they can come to those aha moments and those conclusions to see, oh, that just because I think that way doesn't mean it's true, or, oh, this is where I picked up that thinking pattern, and then that can set the person free to develop new and more healthy thinking patterns in their life. So how do we learn optimism? How do we shift from that cognitive distortion, those automatic responses, to something that is more life-giving, that serves us, and helps us be the type of people that we want to be? Because remember, optimism is going to help you in every area of your life. It's not just about the thinking. It's about the emotions. It's about the stress level. It's about the entire nervous system. It's about the presence that you carry, which then affects your relationships, the way that you interact with people, and it also affects your work. It's a holistic impact. And I think it's important for us to understand it's not just about positive thinking or positive words. It's about something that cascades and spills over into every area of our life. So the first thing I want to address in learning optimism is curiosity. And that should be no surprise to the listeners of this podcast. You know I'm a huge fan of curiosity. It was a big piece of my personal transformation. I remember the first time I was asked to become curious about some of my thinking patterns, about my emotions. I remember how much that shifted me away from self-judgment. It opened me up to self-exploration and self-inquiry. Because remember, as long as you're judging yourself, you're going to stay closed down to yourself. And so if you can become curious, you allow yourself to open up to yourself. And one of the ways that we're going to change the way that we think is become curious about why we're thinking the way we think right now. If you want to get from here to there, we have to begin to ask ourselves, why do I have this specific thinking pattern? And the question that is really important to ask about it is, how is it keeping me safe? How is that thought serving me? Now, you might be thinking that there's nothing good that could be coming out of that type of thinking pattern, those negative thinking patterns. Well, there is something good that's coming out of it. There is something that's serving you, or you wouldn't be doing it. Your brain wouldn't be kicking it up. Listen, everything that we do for a reason. And many times it's to keep us safe. And even, yes, our self-sabotaging behavior is to keep us safe. Yes, even the things that we think are the worst things about us in our life that we don't like, those are all there to try to serve us and to keep us safe. So if you identified yourself in some of those thinking patterns that we talked about earlier, begin to ask yourself the question, how is that type of thinking keeping you safe? For example, if you always kick into I should statements, that might be something that you learned as a child. You were constantly told about what you should or shouldn't do, and you felt like there was something wrong with you, and you felt like you should be acting differently than you are. And that should statement, which is a self-judgment statement, kept you safe because it kept you reflecting on your life and the behaviors that you could potentially change so that you could stay out of trouble, you could stay out of harm, you could stay out of abuse. It was trying to keep you safe by saying, I shouldn't do that. I should be more like this. And that was trying to get you to practice behaviors that would keep you safe. Well, now the challenge is that's kind of stuck with you, right? And you're always judging yourself. You're always looking for something wrong, or you're always saying what you should be like and who you are right now isn't good enough. So that language is trying to serve you, and it got embedded at some point as a safety mechanism, as a behavioral scanning of what you should and shouldn't do, right? It might have come from a moral teaching of religion for you. You got taught about what was a bad person, what was a good person, what was going to keep you out of trouble with God, what was going to cause you to be acceptable with God and acceptable among the faith community. And all of that got wired about what you believe about yourself and what's acceptable for who you are. And so some of that should language is about trying to fit in, trying to be acceptable, trying to stay safe. So it is trying to serve you. So becoming curious about that is really important because it allows us to reframe it, not as something that's wrong with us that we think that way, but understanding that it's trying to serve us and keep us safe. Then that allows us to try to find the way to stay safe without a negative thought. And how can we find a more positive or optimistic thought that still allows us to feel safe? Because here's the challenge with our brains. We're not going to let go of a negative thought that has served us so well, that has kept us safe for so long, right? Even though it's produced stuff that we don't want, it's created challenges for us like imposter syndrome, self-sabotaging, all of those things. But the brain still sees it as something that's keeping us safe. It's not going to let go of that because the brain's priority for you is safety. Now, in order for your brain to let go of that, you have to have something to replace it with that your brain can begin to see that that positive thought, that optimistic thought can keep us safe as well. And yes, the benefits of overall well-being are there as well, but your brain isn't always concerned about overall well-being, right? It's concerned about safety. But if you can replace that thought with something that's optimistic, life-giving, increases your well-being, and also feels safe to you, okay? That's going to be important, and that'll allow that other thought to be let go of, and you'll be able to learn how to be more optimistic in your thinking. Okay, now that we've shifted some of our energy, we've become curious about why we have that thought and how it's keeping us safe. Let's move on to a reframing exercise that you can use anytime, anywhere, that is really powerful and really effective. I use it with the clients that I work with, and it can have a lot of impact in your life as you begin to use it. And there's only 3 steps to this exercise. The first is identify a situation where you have a tendency to fall into a negative thinking pattern, some of those that we discussed earlier. The second is to generate counterproductive thoughts. Okay, we're going to go ahead and let our brain go there. And then the third is to reframe it all. Okay, so let's first talk about identifying a situation where you fall into one of those negative thinking patterns. So go ahead and identify either a current situation that you're starting to fall into a negative thinking pattern around, or something that you've done in the past, and really begin to sit with it. Understand what's going on there. What is or what was the negative type of thinking? Was it a worst case scenario, a catastrophizing? Was it a should? What is that thinking pattern that you have a tendency to fall into? Now, once you've done that, then you move on to identifying 3 to 5 counterproductive thoughts. So if you're in the space of overly generalizing, right, that I'm awkward in the interview, so that means I'm like always awkward in every area of life, go ahead and write 3 to 5 really nasty counter thoughts, right? Get out what your brain wants to say about you. I mean, go ahead and make them negative. Your brain wants to go there. And a lot of times we're in this resistance and are fighting with our brain, right? Our brain wants to think this negative thought. We're saying, no, I think that's not true. But yet we still cycle into it. Go ahead and do 3 to 5 really, bad negative thoughts about that thinking pattern, about that situation, and go ahead and write it out. Get it out of your system. Because what that's going to do for you, 1, it's going to allow you to brain dump. 2, it's going to allow you to see how extreme your thinking can get sometimes, right? And it can get to some of those core beliefs that are underneath it. But sometimes if it just cycles in our brain and we don't get it out and see it, it kind of feels stuck and trapped, and we're not able to evaluate it. And so as you write it out, you're really able to evaluate the way that you're thinking about yourself. And it can also be somewhat therapeutic to get that thought out of your system, to let it be there without judgment. Don't judge it, just let it be there and identify that that thought, what that negative thought is, everything that you just said, is there to try to keep you safe. Because a lot of what we're trying to do with this, and this part of the exercise, is change the relationship that we have with those negative thoughts. Because I hear from so many people, and I know I used to say it to myself, I hate that I think that way. I wish I didn't think that way. What's wrong with me that I have those thoughts? So we're going to go ahead and let them come all out. We're going to get them down on paper. We're going to see how nasty they can be. And then we're going to hold them without judgment. And then we're going to ask ourselves, how is that keeping us safe? And all of that's going to help you change the energy you have with those thoughts. And it's going to allow you to move into the next part of the exercise. Now let's talk about reframing. How do we reframe that entire negative thought pattern and turn it into something optimistic and positive that can serve us? Well, the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to look for evidence that counteracts what we just wrote out, right? So if you said that I always do this thing, I'm always messing up, is there any evidence in your life that you don't mess up? Has there ever been a time where you have done something well or have done something positive? If you have, and you can find that evidence, write that out. Because what we're trying to do in this is to get rid of some of that extreme thinking. For you to say that you always mess up is a pretty extreme statement. But if we don't challenge it, we can't change it. So looking for evidence to show you that that's not the case, that you don't always mess up, that you might have had one time in your life where you did something well, that immediately counteracts that negative thought. See, that's why we wanted to write it out so extreme, because that's the way our brain is actually thinking. And now we're trying to find some evidence that counteracts that extreme type of thinking, which can then help us examine all of those thoughts that we have about ourselves, those negative thoughts, right? Because it's breaking open the way that we think about ourselves and bringing in some truth into it, some light that can shine through the crack in the way that we think about ourselves. So finding some evidence, even if it's just one data point, can really help, because it's going to counteract the I always fail, because you'll find at least one time where you didn't fail, and then you can find another time where you didn't fail, and that can begin to change that voice, because you're no longer able to say that you always do it and be authentic and have that be a true statement about yourself. Now, the second part of reframing is to just sit and reframe it. Ask yourself the question, what's a better way to see this? So, for example, if you had a bad interview, instead of saying, well, I'm always terrible at interviews, I'll never be able to get the job that I want to get, what's wrong with me? You could begin to look at it a different way, reframe it and say, well, maybe I wasn't as prepared as I wanted to be, or next time I'll be able to do better. And then begin to find a better story, a better way to look at what happened, whatever that is, whatever the scenario is, and what works for you. But begin to ask yourself, what is a better way to see this? Because we've already exposed the fallacy in the thinking by seeing how extreme it can be, and then finding some evidence that shows that that type of thinking isn't true. So now what's a more true way to look at it? What's a better way, a more life-giving way to actually look at it? Ask yourself that question and begin to write down that statement. Now, the last part of reframing is to actually have a plan in place. And this also goes into building some resilience, because what we're trying to do is get our brains to feel safe, that we have a plan in place. We have something that we're going to be able to go to. So developing a plan is as simple as saying, if X happens, then I'll do Y. So for example, if you really struggle with public speaking or giving presentations, you can put a plan in place, right? So instead of having your brain go to, I'll never be good at public speaking, I always mess up on it, go ahead, go through that exercise, reframe, and come to the place where you can have a plan that allows your brain to feel safe, that you know you've got something that you can go to. And so if it is public speaking, you can say to yourself, if I freeze in the middle of the speech, I will shift towards looking like I'm being thoughtful. I'll pause, I'll stay calm, and I'll say the next thing that comes to my mind, okay? So instead of having so much panic and fear around drawing a blank in the public speaking moment or in the presentation, you have a plan for yourself. So if you do freeze up and you draw a blank, your brain knows you have a strategy to address it, okay? And it can let go of some of that negative thinking around what's going to happen. So that gives you a tool that, hey, if I do draw a blank, I'm going to pause, I'm going to look like I'm being reflective and thoughtful, and then I'll just say whatever comes to my mind next. Okay, that allows your nervous system to relax a lot, and you can use this strategy for all of those areas where you might have some cognitive distortion. Okay, because what we're trying to do is rewire our brains and teach our brains that just because we're thinking something doesn't mean it's true. We're going to find the evidence, okay, that it's not true. We're then going to reframe that negative thought with a more positive, optimistic thought. And then we're going to have a plan in place for those moments when we revert some of that stinking thinking. We're going to have a plan to say, if it happens, then I've got this plan in place that allows me to begin to feel safe, that I can let go of that thought, that negative bias or that negative distortion that I have. And as you practice this reframing and asking how these thoughts are serving you, what you're doing is you are learning optimism. You're unlearning the negative thinking, and you're learning how to be more optimistic in your thinking. And that's a skill set. Not everybody is born with that, okay? It's something that we learn, it's something that we practice, and it's something that we train ourselves to do. So I hope this episode's been helpful in giving you some tools to help you shift away some of that negative thinking to some more positive thinking that allows you to still feel safe. Now, just a quick reminder, if you've not yet had a chance to follow or to subscribe to this podcast, I want to encourage you to do that. That's going to keep you updated on when new episodes come out. And also, if you haven't had a chance to rate it or review it, that would mean a lot to me if you'd take a moment to do that, because that's going to continue to help broaden the reach of this podcast. And also, if you know somebody who could benefit from the content of this podcast, feel free to share it with them. If it's helping you, I'm sure it'll help them as well. I do want to remind you that if you need resources to help you in your journey, you can see the show notes in this episode to find links to things like a free self-assessment and 30-day guide to having a healthier relationship with yourself. You can learn more about my coaching program, as well as other resources I've created to help you on your journey. You can also go to my website at jerryhenderson.org, or if you want to reach out to me personally, you can send me an email at jerry@jerryhenderson.org, or you can find me on Instagram at jerryahenderson. So thank you for taking your time to listen to this episode of the Permission to Love podcast. And I want to remind you, as always, you are worthy of your own love.